Good morning, Seven Marks. How are we doing? Good? All right. So today is Sunday, July the 14th, as I'm sure you might have known, which means as of about 2 weeks ago, we are now halfway through the year 2024. Can you believe that? Like time, I'm so excited. Time is flying by. And man, it's hot. It's summertime. We're already halfway through our Summer in the Psalm series. It just blows my mind. It blows my mind. July is always a really reflective month for me personally. My birthday is at the beginning of the month. Turned 34 this year. That's fine. My anniversary is in the middle of the month. I was married 11 years ago yesterday. And but if I'm honest, I've been a lot more reflective this year than I normally am. And I think it has something to do with the fact that 1 month from today, my wife and I will drop our firstborn daughter off at kindergarten. Yeah, and I've talked with enough parents ahead of me to know that I'm in for a pretty bittersweet occasion as we say goodbye to one season and welcome in a new one. But if I'm being honest, those are not the strongest emotions that I'm worried about feeling. It's not the thing that I am most concerned about. You see, interestingly enough, 1 month from today, when we drop my daughter off at kindergarten, we will do so at the exact same school that my parents dropped me off at nearly 30 years ago. And so it has not been lost on me that I am very close to being slapped in the face with the heavy hand of reality. There's an uncomfortable truth that I spend a lot of time trying to ignore, and it's this: I have become my parents. No, I'm kidding. That's not the takeaway. The takeaway is this: my time is passing away. My time is passing away faster than I ever realized. And I don't think I felt that very much when I was younger, but I feel it all the time now. And I've talked with enough people who are further along in life than me to know that it only gets stronger the older that you get. The writer Margaret Rankle poetically puts it this way. She says, "Perhaps the reason I didn't feel sad about the onset of fall when I was younger is only that I was younger, with my whole life still ahead. In those days, my only worry was that my real life, the one that I would choose for myself and live on my own terms, was taking too long to arrive. Now I understand that every day I'm given is as real as life will ever get. Now I understand that we are guaranteed nothing, that our days are always running out, that they have always been running out." Our days are running out. And that's a really heavy thought, isn't it? So heavy that most of us spend most of our time trying to ignore that thought with everything in us. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, some of which we will talk about today. But before we get to any of the details, I think it would be helpful maybe to look at a riddle that will help us orient ourselves to the importance of thinking about something that is very difficult to think about. And the riddle comes to us from CARROLL, the wisdom writer of Ecclesiastes. He says this in chapter 7, verses 2 and following. He says, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fool is in the house of mirth." It's like, man, what a strange thing to say. Is that even true? Is it better to be sorrowful than to laugh? Is it better to go to a funeral than to go to a party? Really? Well, the answer, as so often when it comes to wisdom literature, is it depends. CARROLL throughout Ecclesiastes has already told us that you should try to enjoy your life the best you can. Your fleeting days under the sun, try to get the most out of it and enjoy it. So it cannot be the case that it is simply foolish for us to try to enjoy our passing days. I think we're closer to the heart of the matter when we say it's a both and, not an either or. You could think of the house of feasting as a metaphor for the posture of distraction. The places we go, the things we do that help us stay in the moment, help us feel alive, the places we go to be preoccupied, the ways in which we try to find pleasure in the moment. Conversely, we might think of the house of mourning as a metaphor for the posture of reflection. The places that we go and the things that we do that remind us that we are mortal. The places we go to find perspective. The ways in which we grieve and learn to give up. And I think Kohelet's point here is that you need both, because they both do different things to us. The problem, of course, is that we want only and always the house of feasting. If we had a choice, it's the house of feasting for us all the time. And why not? I mean, we're 21st century modern Westerners, right? The dream of the perpetual house of feasting, it has never seemed closer within our grasp. Generally speaking, we're the wealthiest people who have ever lived in the entire history of the world. We have more toys and tech to keep us distracted than ever. We have more and better medicine and technology to help us live longer. We have more options and opportunities, more places to go and things to do, more connections and connectivity. We have things to watch on TV. We've got books to read. We've got Amazon Prime Day coming up. We've got career ladders to climb. We've got things to build and remodel and update and fix. And man, we have never had more of everything like we do right now. We have more of everything except for time. And that's the danger with the house of feasting. If you're not careful, you can spend your whole life there. And at the end of the day, it's a distraction. The house of feasting is an illusion. It's an attempt for us to cobble together eternity out of a bunch of fleeting moments and experiences and feelings. And if you're not careful, the danger is that before you even know it, the measure of your days has been spent on a bunch of things that never really mattered as much as you thought they did. Never really brought the fullness of life that you hoped they would. Please hear me. Not without good intentions have many people gotten to the end of their days only to realize, awash in disappointment and regret, that they mislived. But it doesn't have to be that way. Tish Harrison Warren says it this way. She says, most of us spend much time and energy trying to avoid the reality that we and those we love will die. But in facing the reality of death, we learn how to live rightly. We learn how to live in light of our limits and the brevity of our lives. And we learn to live in the hope of the resurrection. I know the house of feasting is where we all want to be. But occasionally, the house of mourning is the place that we must go, for it is a place of wisdom. And there's good news in kind of a morbid way here. The truth is, it's impossible to spend all of your days in the house of feasting. Sooner or later, life has a way of calling us all with an invitation to the house of mourning. Sometimes the invitation comes in the form of a birthday or an anniversary. Sometimes the invitation comes through a major life event, like taking your firstborn to kindergarten or finally coming up to retirement. And all too often, the invitation comes through pain, through loss, through tragedy, through disappointment, and our brushes with death. The question is not if you will find yourself in the house of mourning. You will be there. The question is, what will you do when you get there? And what will you take away when you leave? We're not without resources as we wonder about questions such as these. And so if you have a Bible, I hope that you will join me, whether physical Bible, pull it up on your phone. We're going to be in Psalm chapter 90 today. We've been in Psalms all summer long. We're going to continue today in chapter 90. And as you're getting yourself there, pulling it up on your phone, I'm just going to read the whole passage. It's not that long. So dial in and I'll read it here. I'm in the ESV if you're following along. Psalm 90, verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and the wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to your children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Psalm 90. A couple introductory comments. If you remember all the way back in week 1 of our series, Pastor Paul noted there's 150 chapters in the book of Psalms, but they're broken down into 5 books. And Psalm 90 is the introductory psalm to book number 4. And it makes a lot of sense that it's placed here because the overarching theme of book 3 of the Psalms is all about learning to wait with hope for God to keep his covenant promises, to send the Messianic King, to forgive his people's sin, liberate them from exile. And you better believe it, that an important part of learning to wait with hope is learning how to wait through all of the things that make it hard to hope, like loss and pain and death and tragedy and exile. And so scholars believe that Psalm 90 is a communal lament. It doesn't speak of some specific tragedy, but more of a general sense. It's inviting God's people to mourn over the tragedy and the brevity of our lives outside the Garden of Eden. Psalm 90 is an invitation into the house of mourning so that we can gain wisdom. For our purposes today, I want us to think through this psalm in kind of 3 movements. God's relationship to time, our relationship to time, and then our relationship with God through time. First, let's think about God's relationship to time. The psalmist begins by holding high the transcendence of the eternal God. Before the universe was formed, before the earth was made, from everlasting to everlasting, God simply is. And I can't wrap my mind around that any more than you can. God is simply not like us. He is not bound by time the way that we are. He is not subject to change or decay or death in the way that we are. There is only a beginning because he says so. And there is no other end but the one that he intends. Time is, from God's perspective, one long story. His story. But we're not like that, are we? So let's talk about our relationship to time. We are finite creatures. We have a beginning, a measure of days. The psalmist says 70, or maybe if we're lucky, 80 years. And then we have an end. We come from the dust, and one day to the dust we shall return. This is the way of all flesh. And so in one sense, death is the most natural thing in the world. It may be the one thing that you and I all have in common. But that's not exactly what the psalmist is drawing our attention to, is it? You see, we may be dirt creatures, but we were made for life with God. And so the psalmist is alerting us to a deeper truth about death here, to the fact that it's not natural. It's not supposed to make, there's a reason that death feels to us like a tragedy, like an evil, like it shouldn't be this way. In the biblical imagination, that is true and more so. Death is a cancer. It is an intrusion. It is a problem that must be solved. And it is a consequence. It is a consequence experienced by finite creatures who are alienated from the God who is life. And we are alienated from the God who is life because of our sin. This is what the psalmist laments. Verse 3, you return man to dust, and you say, return, O children of man. Verses 7 through 11, for we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? Which brings us now to our relationship with God through time. The psalmist has created quite a dilemma for us here, hasn't he? God has one relationship to time. To him, 1,000 years is like yesterday. It's like a watch through the night. But our relationship to time is not like that. To us, 1,000 years is 40 generations of the human family. So how is it that we, of all people, could be in relationship with God? We're like grass. We spring up in the morning, but by the end of the day, under the unrelenting heat of the sun, we wither away. How can we, who are so full of sin, be in relationship with the eternal God? There would be no hope. There would be no resolution to this question, this dilemma, if not for verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. The psalmist grounds this whole meditation in the idea that God is a dwelling place for his people. That the one who is not subject to time is holding his people through time, though they are passing away. I love this observation from Derek Kidner. He's an Old Testament scholar. He says the opening of the psalm corresponds to the close, in that God is seen here as our God, whose eternity is the answer, not simply the antithesis to our homelessness and our brevity of life. You see, though we are passing away, we belong to God, which is why the whole posture of this prayer pivots in verse 12. It's not just a comparison between the differences of God and human beings when it comes to time. It's not just a lament about our mortality. It's an invitation for wisdom. It's an invitation into the house of mourning. Which is why he says in verse 12 and following, so teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Verse 13, return, O Lord, which is the same as verse 3. God returns us to dust. We beg him to return back to us. Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. It is in the house of mourning that we begin to see something pretty special. That death, it is not just a sign that everything has gone wrong. It is a signpost, pointing us, alerting us to a different and better future. Which is so counterintuitive, right? I mean, think about it. Death, that's the end of the story. It should be an occasion for utter hopelessness. And yet the psalmist goes in exactly the opposite direction with it. For him, reflections on death become an occasion for hope. That God will eventually, somehow, some way, and we think, I can't explain it yet, I don't understand it, but God's going to keep his promises to his people. And don't miss this. The hope is that God would keep his promises through his people. Do you see this at the end of the psalm? Establish the work of our hands through the generations of our family. According to the psalmist, our short lives, they're not just a tragedy, they are an opportunity. They are an invitation from the eternal God to participate, if only for a moment, in the grand story that he's telling. And here's the coolest part, at least to me. Psalm 90 and many other reflections like it in the Hebrew Bible, they instructed and nourished God's people for a long time. Through pain, loss, through tragedy, through disappointment, through exile, through death, generation after generation after generation. until one day, in time, in history, Paul says, when the time was right, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so that he could adopt us as his very own children. Whoa. The eternal Son of God, the Word of God, becomes flesh, becomes subject to time and to mortality for us? Yes. And one day in history, Paul says, at just the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God proves his love to us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ died for us in time, in history. I love this from Paul David Tripp. He says, how could we not be blown away by God's patience as we make our way through the grand redemptive story? How could we not be amazed by the thousands of years between the fall in Eden and the victory of the empty tomb? How could we not be comforted by the fact that in patience, God's judgment still waits while his mercy works? How could we miss the fact that our daily hope is connected to our Savior's patience and grace? Both the meta story in the Bible and our individual stories are portraits of an ever faithful and patient Redeemer. Tripp continues, God's work is a process, not an event. Redemption is longevity work. Redemption is legacy work. Redemption takes time. I love that picture. Redemption is a legacy work. It takes time. It takes more time, actually, than you and I have to live. But that's okay. Because nothing really worth accomplishing can be done in one lifetime anyway. And God is holding us throughout all generations. As we said earlier, Psalm 90 was originally written to an audience to help them wait with hope as they expected the Messiah to come for the first time. But that's not our moment in the story, is it? We stand on the other side of the decisive moment in history, the death and resurrection of Jesus, which has changed every moment in time since. And so, Psalm 90 is a little bit different for us. We have experienced the life and the love of the Messiah, but we are still waiting, and we are still dying. Which means that Psalm 90 is just as much a gift to us as it was to God's people in the Old Testament, as it invites us to think deeply about the one thing that we never like to think about, so that we can live with wisdom. Lord, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So how do we do that? And maybe a more important question is, can we do that without experiencing a tragedy or a major life event? And I actually think the answer is yes, through the practice or the practices of what we'll call spiritual timekeeping. That's a phrase I'm borrowing from James K.A. Smith, whose writing has been super helpful to me in thinking through these topics. And he says, spiritual timekeeping is not about trying to unravel the mysteries of time. It's not some Jesus-y version of time management or something like that. It's about the recognition that God is working his purposes out through history. And so spiritual timekeeping is about learning to keep time or to keep in step with the Spirit who is working through the generations of God's people to accomplish all of God's purposes. For our purposes today, I want us to think about spiritual timekeeping similar to how we thought about Psalm 90, through three movements: the past, the present, and the future. So let's talk about the past. The first act of spiritual timekeeping is remembering the past. And that's important for a couple reasons. The first is the past, I think you know this, is a pretty tricky place. It's a tricky place because we have trouble remembering. I don't know about you, but I'm super forgetful. Once a day is gone, it is out of my mind in a heartbeat, which I think is why many of us are prone to nostalgia. We love being presented with these idealized versions of the past that never actually existed. I think it's a way for us to kind of escape our disappointments with the present. But we're forgetful people. The other thing that makes the past so tricky, and maybe more so than nostalgia, is simply ignorance of the past. And as I'm sure you've heard before, those who are ignorant of the past, they are doomed to repeat it. See, the truth is, at least historically speaking, God's story did not begin with us. It's been going for a really long time now, which means we should be able to see the fingerprints of God's activity through his Spirit in the lives of people throughout the generations, through the events and these different things that have happened that have shaped the world that we live in now. The people of the past in relationship with God have shaped our present. And one day we will do that for those who come after us. And a little bit closer to home, the events of your life, the ups and downs, the highs, the lows, the things you remember fondly, the things that you love to forget, they are also shaping your present as well. See, that's the other tricky thing about the past. It's never really past, which is why it is often worth going back and reflecting afresh. And listen, I get it. We don't like to go to the past for a lot of reasons. We fear the sense of regret that we might experience, maybe some guilt and shame as we think back, disappointments, discomforts. We begin to settle into the what ifs, to the roads not taken, to the things that could have, maybe should have been different, and we get stuck. And I get that. But I think that's the case because we often only know how to see the past from our limited vantage point. Oh Lord, would you teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom? You see, time doesn't work for God like it does for us. The past is never past, and the story is not over yet, which means just because you can't go back and change anything doesn't mean that God can't continue redeeming it. James Smith again, he puts it so beautifully. He says, if all that I have become and learned and acquired and experienced was just overwhelmed and made null by grace, then salvation would be an obliteration rather than a redemption. The God who saves is a God who wants to unleash the unique constellation of talents and experiences that make me who I've become. When my history, including its trauma and wounds, intersects with the renewing power of the Spirit, a chemical reaction of possibility awaits. Grace, he says, is not a time machine. Grace is not a reset button. Grace is something even more unbelievable. It is a restoration. It is reconciliation of and despite our histories of animosity. Grace isn't an undoing. It is an overcoming. God's not done with your past. I hope you know that. I hope you know that God can redeem everything about your story for his purposes. So let's talk about the present. Our world is obsessed with now. And for good reason. Now is where we live our lives. Now is where I'm busy with family and friends and work and yard work and taking care of my body and going grocery shopping and a bazillion other things that have to be done. Which means the danger for all of us, because the present looms so large in our imaginations, the danger is always that we will fall prey to believing that the present is all there is or all that really matters. And if the present is all that matters, that pressures us into living beyond our boundaries in violation of our limits and our humanity. It tends to push us towards extremes, trying to get way too much out of our days or expecting way too little out of our days. Oh Lord, would you teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom? As you see, if God has been faithful throughout all the generations, then I can live, you can live open-handedly and non-anxiously in the present. We can resist the extremes. Ours is a posture that's a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated, which is why it requires so much wisdom. As we can, we are invited into the house of feasting. Enjoy the blessings of God's good world. Enjoy the blessings that God has given you while you can enjoy them. But because we're also not afraid of the house of mourning, we're not so easily deceived into believing that the present, with all that it has to offer, could ever fully and finally satisfy us. Psalm 90 gives us language to pray here, doesn't it? Oh Lord, would you establish the work of our hands? Would you bring your kingdom in our generation? And if not, would you use our lives and our generations to further your purposes for the day when you do bring your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven? Which brings us now at last to the future. The future, like the past, is a little bit of a tricky place. But unlike the past, we have no access to it. We can guess, we can predict, we can prepare, but we cannot know. And because we cannot know, that's where hope comes in. Hope is what you do when you cannot know the future, which means if you want to know what you really think about tomorrow, pay attention to how you live today. Future hope is worked out in the present, which means people are telling you what they think about the future all the time. Is the future all up to us to bring it about? Is the future all about us? Or does nothing really matter because in the end we die anyway? So let's just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. These are very popular postures in our culture. But I think that there's a better option for us. Oh Lord, would you teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom? And if God has been faithful throughout all generations, then the God who began this story will bring it to his ending. And what is the ending that this God has in mind for his people? It is union with him. It is faithfulness. It is healing and wholeness. It is forgiveness and relationship. It is peace and rest and love. And so just imagine with me for a second, 7 marks, if that future became our hope in the present. If we began to live in such a way where we tried to work that future out through our present lives in this moment. 5th century monk Saint Benedict famously said, "Day by day, keep your death before you." That's what it means to go into the house of mourning. We go in order to reflect on death and be renewed in the hope that death is not the end of the story. Because as the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. But each in turn. Christ the first fruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him. Then the end will come, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. That's what we're waiting for. We're waiting for the victory of Jesus. So as we close today, I want to invite you to bow your heads and close your eyes where you sit. And just for a moment here, as we're together, I want to invite you into the house of mourning. And to do that, I want to read an exhortation over us as we close that has been really, really meaningful to me. It's from a book called Every Moment Holy. And I know that in my own times in the house of mourning, I often struggle with the right words to say, the right things to pray. And so it has been a source of life for me. And so my prayer is that I read this over you, and as we conclude and go on our way today, that it will be a source of blessing and hope and encouragement for us while we wait for King Jesus to return. It goes like this: Children of the living God, let us now speak of dying. And let us speak without fear. For we have already died with Christ, and our lives are not our own. Our dying is part of the story that God is telling to us, and part of the story God is telling through us. It is not a dark and hopeless word we must take pains to skirt or mention only in hushed whispers, lest our conversations grow awkward and uncomfortable. Rather, death is a present and unavoidable reality, and one through which we, the people of God, must learn to openly walk with one another. Yes, it is cause for lament. Death is a horrible and inevitable sorrow. It is grief. It is numb shock and raw pain and long seasons of weeping and ache. And we will experience it as such. But it is more than all of that, for it is also a baptism, a prelude to a celebration. Our belief in Christ, that he is raised from the dead, promises a great hope, that there will be a newness of life, a magnificent resurrection that follows death and swallows it entirely. Death will not have the final word, so we need not fear to speak it. Death is not a period that ends a sentence, it is but a comma, a brief pause before the fuller thought unfolds into eternal life. Beloved of Christ, do not hide from this truth. Each of us in time must wrestle death, so we should remember it throughout our lives, that we might arrive at last, well prepared to follow our Lord into the valley, and through it, further still, to our resurrection. Death is not the end of life. It is an intersection, a milestone we pass in our eternal pursuit of Christ.